Welcome everyone to the Free State Open 2015 final. And the motion, as the West, the South would act to prevent Russian and Iranian military action in Syria. I'd like to call the Prime Minister to open the debate for us. Here.
When America went into Iraq, when America went to Afghanistan, there was no force to oppose these. 15 years later, we have the harms that exist there. We are trying to stop Putin from turning Syria into his own personal Afghanistan. I think that it's important that we get rid of Assad, and the people who are trying to entrench his power ought to be stopped. Syria, Russia, and Iran have the strategic interest of maintaining Assad in power. We think that the debate isn't about whether Assad is a good person or not, because those are concessions already agreed that we need to get rid of him. I think that we then ought to protect people who are trying to oppose this hegemonic power. We think that it's particularly beneficial. What are we actually talking about in today's debate? And what do we actually mean when we say prevent Russia, right? We tell you firstly, we do things such as like more diplomatic things like place sanctions that act as like negative incentives, right? Because although they might argue that incentives don't really work, they were able to cripple the economy of Russia within that the oil exchange that actually affected them is something that's significant, right? We have them sign things like pacts and treaties. But at a point where they don't do it, we tell you that it's okay for us to use our own soldiers, right? We fight your guns with our own guns. Within that, we can take this military act because the strategic interests of Russia and Iran are ones that are not in the best interest of the Middle East. Within that, these are harms. Go ahead, Frank. Go ahead. No. So we then have to talk about what is the actual problem with the Russian military, right? And there's two problems with this. Firstly, how they've been able to conduct themselves in the last 10 years is that they have high casual rates, right? So their own military strikes are ones that don't specifically attack the people that are trying to attack, but there are casualties of war. We think that this is something that's particularly beneficial, right? But the second level of this then is that these military attacks are actually discriminatory, right? So women, people who aren't part of the war, people who aren't part of the combat are victims. Within that, we're trying to improve how countries specifically engage in war because we've placed a negative view on strategic wars and why those wars ought to be fought. No, go ahead, guys. So let's then talk about what are the actual strategic aims of Russia. Because these are important in talking about why we ought to stop Russia and Iran, right? Russia right now is trying to secure power within the Middle East. And how they want to do this is by keeping Assad in power. This is because they have a naval base located in Syria, one that serves their own strategic interests. That at a moral consequence, they aren't acting in the best interest of people in Syria. Within that, these are individuals that are acting within their own strategic interests. These are interests that are particularly harmful, right? So we then think that those strategic interests are ones that we ought to do away with. Within that, when we then talk about the West, I'll take you just now. It's then more accountable. Within that, it's better to hold those people accountable. But I'll talk about why that's true. Go.
Because the international politics and especially how government acts externally in terms of other countries is based on their own interests and how their own interests would accrue to themselves in comparison to other individuals.
Yeah, sure.
And you kill that mechanism.
Definitely. Look, we then have to do a comparative of like the West's interest versus the ones in Russia. And that type of comparative then determines how we then engage and what we view as a legitimate interest and why that's beneficial. I'll flag you when I actually deal with it.
Yeah.
What are the aims of site opening? government, we have two things. Firstly, we want to have responsible military warfare, and secondly, we want to have greater accountability in holding people account, because we think that that's particularly beneficial. So then, why is the West better, right? Because they then talk about political interests and how you serve your own interests. We tell you that firstly, they're doing something that everyone in today's debate agree is particularly beneficial. The interest of the West would be indirectly to remove Assad, right? So by making sure that the people fighting against Assad, stopping the rebels, people that have the capability to remove him, that is an indirect way in which they aid the removal of Assad. I think that's the type of strategic interest. We think that's better for Syria, because you remove that type of individual. That's the type of interest, firstly, that is beneficial as compared to having Russia trying to impose their own laws and actually secure Syria for their own nodes, right? But secondly, there's these policies are more multilateral. No, go away, guys. Because then the West specifically isn't just America, right? We talk about specifically top-tier nations that can hold each other accountable, have some sort of power to keep each other accountable, because then they are part of, they're going to be victims of scrutiny because of public perception. Then the public perception is what has shaped the USA's policies on military intervention right now. The fact that societies are more aware of the discourse around going that. I think that's how we then hold these people accountable. Because then we're better able, even as a society, to hold these people accountable. We're better able to then hold them under scrutiny and view the actual policies. The idea of power sharing and the idea of that the West is better able to hold each other accountable is the reasons why we then ought to have this, because we have greater accountability. But before I talk about my final argument, Frank.
Okay, so the problems that we have, the internal problems that we have in Syria are as a result of the US as well as the West funding rebel groups like ISIS to fight against the Assad regime. How can we trust actors that are so haphazard with their foreign policy to be the right actors to deal with the issues in Syria?
Because if we're going to talk about the more practical aspect of this debate, if you don't have the West, then it simply means that you have Russia and Iran being the only individuals. The problem there is the fact of what their strategic interests actually are. When we then evaluate this debate in terms of that comparison, the strategic interest of the West is actually better. But let's say that's not the case, right? Let's say that, well, they are haphazard and are going to just fund these rebels, right? We then look at what that actually means in terms of acting as a symbol. That has been a catalyst to ensure that we actually get rid of Assad. We think that that's fine, that's better than not having this individual be removed within the type of power that they have. Because we then tell you that it's more clearer when you have some sort of strategic interests that are ones that we hold into people accountable, right? So what we then have to evaluate as being the most important is what the obligation of the West is and what their interest would be in today's debate, right? The idea of immigration being a problem within Europe, we think that those are incentives enough for these countries to aid within this because they want to preserve their own national sovereignty. We think that all of those problems are things that exist in status quo and are things that facilitate these people having some sort of obligation, having some sort of incentive to ensure that we establish some sort of peace. Because the spillover effects of that has affected their countries and the stability of their countries specifically. We think that the interests of Russia and Iran are one that are particularly harmful to Syria. We think that Assad's regime is one that we need to get rid of. We think that open government wins today's debate.
two prime ministers stood up in today's debate. There's one prime minister who came in and said, look at all the terrible things the West has done in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the other prime minister stands up and says, no, the West should be the one who facilitates this intervention anyway. So their model itself is to create a fuck-up in order to prevent a greater one from happening in the future. They create such a massive harm that their specific harm is the basis for their case in the very first place. So D-Watch has to choose, so which prime minister is he going to support in today's case, and which one is he going to shove? Secondly, he says they make this case why it's better for multilateral action. Well, we feel as the world is much more multilateral if the West is willing to cooperate with Russia. Adding more countries to a coalition that be willing to end a war in Syria is far more beneficial, right? Because they haven't showed us how the Russia is specifically unwilling to negotiate. Russia has specifically and readily told that said, hey guys, we have to have a solution to this to this water. We have to specifically have a solution to this, and we're willing to have Western help and involvement in this case. Furthermore, he says somehow the West has the ability to stop this. And what is his model? Sanctions or war. Okay, let's deal with these both two terrible ideas. Firstly, under the idea of sanctions. Did this work in Ukraine? Yeah, Russia's economy was hurt, but Russia really doesn't care. They view their national interest as more important than concerns that people in the West are faced with. During the Second World War, they still call this the Great Patriotic War, where they lost 20 million people and a third of their economy. They don't really care. They're really, really patriotic, and they're willing to take these losses. Furthermore, on this idea of war, we feel as though the idea of a possible nuclear exchange, World War III and the end of the war, is a little bit worse than the current situation in Syria, or a little bit worse than not intervening. I think, depending on your value system, maybe World War III is good, maybe World War III is bad. This is the specific reason why Russia and the West haven't gone to war in the past, and why military intervention against Russian interests has never happened in history while nuclear weapons have existed, right? So you have to debate within the frames of reality in order to be relevant within this debate, and we don't think that that's happened. So lastly, what they say is the strategic aims of Russia. They want to control the Middle East. Well, we don't think that the West has done an amazing job of this up till this point. We find that currently, that if the West can't control the entirety of the Middle East by itself, then allowing Iran and Russia to take some of this slack is actually a good idea, because unless you enjoy refugees that you're going to reject anyway at the end of the day, you find if you want these terrible harms, if you want to commit war crimes, then yeah, OG should win this debate. Cool, I'm going to give you 3 points. I'm going to show you specifically in terms of the motion why preventing this is impossible or really, really dumb. Secondly, I'm going to show you why Russian and Iranian military involvement are far more legitimate than any other means, and how they're willing to have the West help, and how this is the best possible solution. But firstly, I'm going to tell you about the conditions in Syria and the actors in today's debate, something that we should have had in terms of contextualization, right? So what do we have? Well, we've got 3 main military actors in Syria. We've got the coalition of the Free Syrian Army and the rebels, we've got ISIS, and we've got the Syrian government. The coalition of moderate rebels, they would have you find, is a decent way to handle the country. One, there are thousands of disparate groups, they don't coordinate, and they themselves have committed war crimes and atrocity. They aren't much better than Assad, because if they had the capability to do what Assad did, that's specifically what they would do. They haven't shown themselves to be paragons of human rights, and the West has pretty much screwed up supporting them up until this point. Secondly, we find Syria's Assad is a dictator, yes, but there's a lot of dictators all over the world, risking a World War III or a major geopolitical confrontation to get rid of this specific dictator is really bad. And if you're going to make a defense of Western liberal claims, we find fundamentally this is dangerous, right? Well, because you have to express these claims within yourself, and the West within itself is going to promote these ideas. They shouldn't be intervening elsewhere in the world at the same time. But lastly, what's the group that's most likely to take power if Assad falls? It's going to be ISIS, because this is specifically what they did in Iraq, and this is specifically what they've done in large parts of Syrian territory where the Assad regime has crumbled. We find that ISIS is a worse alternative, because if they capture Syria's biological or chemical weapons, we find this is a dangerous outcome for the world as a whole, and we find it's dangerous for the people. You can't say you want a democratic regime, you want human rights, but okay, it's fine if ISIS just runs the country in a power vacuum. The West is really great at intervening in places, but not thinking of the consequences of what happens afterwards. Lastly, in terms of capability, they don't have terms in terms of either military control. 2,000 soldiers are really hard to dismantle, especially when Russia has already set up an advanced air defense system network in Syria at the moment. Secondly, we find in terms of like military, they can't persuade them diplomatically because this is not within the capabilities to do as is in status quo. Thirdly, if we discuss the idea of actual military intervention, because this is a complex situation, it's best to have as many multilateral actors. We're going to use their point and make it one of the main points of our case, because we believe that a multilateral intervention is best because Russia is specifically willing to have these actors do this. And Russia, they've even specifically said that, hey, we're willing to get Assad out, we're really willing to dismantle large parts of the regime, but I'll take you at 6, right, when the bank comes. But we find specifically that Russia is willing to negotiate Assad's exit. If we want Assad's exit, we just have to ask him to go, and then we can have the process of decisively ending this war. This is what they're willing to do. After 200,000 deaths, they've become a lot more pragmatic, ladies and gentlemen. This is just the facts on this ground. This is nothing that can really be disputed. If we discuss like the greater threat at the end of the day, we find that if you need a stronger sovereign entity over state, we want this to come from a multilateral constitution. You want this to come from Russia. I'll take you. Okay, you're chilled now. Cool. Fine. What we fundamentally find at the end of the day, right, is that if you want democracy and human rights, the first thing you have to have is you have to have a state, and the best way to have that is to use a state that happens to already exist. We believe that once the West has intervened along with Russia, or if Russia has intervened and done this, or if the West just chills and doesn't do anything at all, this makes a fairly easy burden for us to win today's debate. What you end up having is that you have bargaining chips. If you specifically have military troops on the ground in Syria, it's a lot easier to persuade the regime to become diplomatic. By engaging its system, you have a lot more influence in that system, right, than if you stand outside and condemn from afar. The West's condemnation has never really carried much weight outside the Western world as a whole. We don't think that they're particularly effective in this debate, and if they can't do something, they should let someone else do it. Russia's military interventions have not always been great, but they're better than nothing, and we find that it's a decisive end of the war. It's something that is specifically guaranteed and warranted in today's debate. But if we talk at like the political power, the situation in there, we find that the Syrian rebels within themselves aren't competent to run the country, they aren't willing to run the country, and they aren't really willing to handle these effects. But we find at the end of the day, this is why we win, because we've shown you that a decisive end to the war is far better than Western hypocrisy and a failed Western intervention. But they've proven to us that it's
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So let us have a look at what this debate is really about before we deal with the mess of the debate that Devon has just made, right? So what we need to evaluate in this debate are really two main things. Firstly, is there a need or is it desirable to prevent and stop the current ongoing Russian and Iranian military action going on in Syria? And then secondly, who is the best actor? So if not them, who, right? And that's where their clash comes in and they say the West is bad, but let's just get Iran and Russia to cooperate with the West and that would be better, right? Because the West has been hypocritical and the West will now all of a sudden change. And these are things that are not grounded in reality, as I will need to go on to show in my analysis. So what I bring to you is a further extension on our issue and our main pillar in this debate about accountability, because ultimately what we are saying at government is that we want the actor that militarily intervenes in Syria
to be able to be held accountable. We want good military intervention. We want military intervention with minimal civilian casualties. We want military intervention that can be held accountable and can be kept in check. And this is why our model of multilateral, specifically being the West's multilateral action, is far much better than the Iran-Russian dynamic, where Iran and Russian allegiance has hidden agendas that I'll further elaborate on. So let's deal with what Devon brings to us. So Devon tries to do two very sneaky things, right? The first thing he doesn't really engage with Russian and West dynamics and in international relations, right? So we need to understand, and it's not a secret to anybody, that Vladimir Putin antagonizes the West at every turn. He takes pleasure in antagonizing the international community. As Devon says in his own analysis, that diplomatic means of persuading Russia will not work. They do not work. They did not work with countless of issues where Russia remains standing, in fact, differs in views with the international communities, especially with things such as protection of minorities, things such as free speech, things such as respecting sovereignty of nations, Ukraine, all of those things. But Devon will say, your means of sanctions and trade sanctions didn't work. It did work with Ukraine because Russia didn't take over Ukraine and stop. So we say that worked. Neo, you disagree?
I think it's fundamentally bad that you want to put Russia in the spotlight where they don't give individuals some freedoms. But secondly, then what? Like if we do this and then what? What happens?
Okay, so the main problem we have with you is that you haven't really interrogated Russia's intentions and Russia and Iran's agenda with this. So because Russia has the capability to do so, doesn't mean that they're the best actor to do so. Why we say this is because they are held less accountable. I'll deal with it in my point about accountability. I also have some rebuttals that are flagged about their matter. So what are we saying at government about accountability? We say that multilateral military action by the West is far more accountable in terms of agenda, in terms of method and manner, than we can ever hold Russia and Iran accountable. Why is this? Let's look at Western countries. We see that there are two things that characterize Western countries. Firstly is civilian pressure. Western countries respond to internal pressures from their civilians arising out of their opinions and what they want to do. So when US citizens hear about the war in Vietnam and they start saying, bring back our troops, as they did with Afghanistan, we see that international pressure starts to flow as well as internal pressure on these Western countries, and this is why they are more held accountable. The second level is that when it's multilateral, so we have Germany, we have the US, we have France, we have the UK, they're both of similar powers and can keep each other in check. Let's look at the Iran-Russia power dynamic where Russia basically gets to do whatever they want and Iran must follow. We see that the civilians aren't in a position where they have a voice or are even allowed to voice their opinions. So we see that that's a lack of accountability. And two, their bilateral action is really one country, and that's Vladimir Putin. And that is why it is very troublesome. Then we need to look at their interests, right? So we tell you directly that Russia's interests are directly incidental to the West's interests. Russia's interests are to secure Syria and use it, as they already have a naval base in Syria. Devon says they've got a fancy air defense system. Yes, they do, because they have a naval base there as well. So Russia has an interest in securing Syria because of its strategic position in the Middle East. Russia wants to further its own agenda, and the problem with Russia's agenda is that we can't hold Russia accountable. But the benefits of the West agenda and why we know it can be safe is because there are multiple countries of similar powers that can keep each other in check and responsible. And that is why we say the West is a better and more desirable actor. Number two, we talk about the particular military action. Let's look at the recent strike action that we saw by Russia and Iran on these rebels, right? No, thank you, all of you, sit down. What we saw is it's characterized by high casualties, and including women and children. And what we're saying about this is that this is bad military action. Good military action minimizes civilian casualties, targets the targets strategically, and does it in a manner that is acceptable universally and internationally. Who is more likely to abide by this? obviously it's going to be the West, because Russia does not care about Western concerns, and Russia will actually oppose. No, thank you. So we see that in the question of today's debate, it isn't whether it will be successful or whether it will be pretty to prevent Russia or Iran from intervening, but whether it's something we ought to do. And what we are saying in government is that it ought to be done because Russia cannot be trusted. Russia's agenda, particularly Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, cannot be trusted because he has been seen as a provocative and an antagonistic leader in today's global politics. What are you talking about when we ground it in reality? We say Russia hasn't been the best friends with the West, and Russia and Iran aren't most likely to say, let's all go in as a team, because their interests are incidental. Whilst the West wants to stabilize, Russia wants to conquer and utilize. And that is why we beg to oppose this, we beg to propose and stop Russian-Iranian military action.
So exactly what happened right now when the UFS decides to cheer when I come through, and they're going to cheer when another Wits team comes through, when Wits does that, is because that's exactly how international politics works. Individuals always act on best interests for themselves and how those certain individuals or benefits accrue to themselves. That's international politics. That's the argument we bring to you. That's the argument that they don't speak to. It's quite problematic when you want to stop the interest of an individual, because as they want to decipher as the West, they always have the hegemony on what moral standards are, on what values are, on what is good and what is bad for everyone in the world. We think it's quite problematic that you say that Putin likes to antagonate the West, because the West likes to antagonate Russia, right? That's how it is geopolitical stance from the Cold War. But secondly, you don't look at people like China and Iran that justifiably like Russia or support Russia in the endeavors that they do. We think you don't want to monopolize. The problem with the argument is that you want to monopolize moral values and moral decisions on what the West decides. We think it's fundamentally flawed. That is not justified, right? So let's tell you a couple of things that I'm going to bring to you in this debate. One, it's the politics that exists. We think they've only looked at Russia, but they haven't looked at Iran. And why strategically right for Iran to take steps in order to defend themselves. Exactly as the West ally that they want to portray, like Israel, when they strike Palestine, because they want to strategically protect themselves from all individual harms that could accrue to them. I'll speak to that. They don't speak to that, right? So they're out. But secondly, their own endeavor on the war of terror, right? We think that that's a Western liberal idea, that terrorism is really bad, it's problematic, and they fight and they want to end terror in different places. We think it's fundamentally flawed that they don't speak to that. But thirdly, they also don't speak to the greatest threat, and they don't make a way up of why we would take Bashar al-Assad out instead of having him there and remove ISIS. We think that the greater threat analysis needs to come out when you look at the war on terror and how the USA and the West works on the war on terror. But fourthly, it's the vacuum mechanism that Devon tells you about, which none of them speak about. The vacuum mechanism says one thing. When you take away a structure that can do something, it's quite problematic. Why? Because in the vacuum that any individual can come up and take up that space. That's why we have things like ISIS in terms of like the Middle East, because the West has decided to start wars there, make a vacuum, and people like ISIS who have agendas now see that the power structures that exist there don't exist anymore, and they take up that space. Quite problematic when you have vacuums and individuals take up that vacuum, right? We think that those points are going to come up in my speech. But let me tell you like other interesting stuff, which I think that Wash doesn't speak to, right? So I'm not going to rebut, like, what Vusi said, because I think Devon adequately did that. All I'm going to say is, like, accountability, and why his mechanism of accountability is really wrong. So his whole analysis that he works on is that, like, somehow the West is accountable on itself, somehow the West holds itself accountable for every decision that they make by their political stance on individuals on the ground. You know what the problem is in terms of that mechanism of accountability? It all hinges on what the American public decides is good or bad, not what the Iranians or the Syrian people decide what is good or bad in terms of action for themselves. It's always based on what the Americans believe. It's fundamentally bad that you want to do this. It's fundamentally bad that you say every time what is good and bad in society must be dictated by America and what the individuals in America believe. Secondly, what's problematic on that case, sit down all of you, what's problematic on the case is that you don't want to look at the aspect in which America does very fucked up things but perpetuates their ideas in terms of the media for people to believe what they want to. If accountability is really good, George Bush would be in front of the ICC, taken by Americans for what he did in the Middle East. Those decisions are not made, those decisions don't enter. Tony Blair is not in front of the ICC for war crimes in all the Islamic countries. We think it's problematic that your accountability mechanism doesn't speak to that, right? So it's problematic. Sit down, Wash, you're out of it. So problematic stuff that I'm going to bring to you in this debate, right? I'm going to speak to you about the first part, the politics, right? And especially why in terms of like Russia, when Devon tells you why it's justified for Russia to go in. But secondly, to speak on the homogeneous tasks, that like the homogeneous individual like decisions that America makes when they believe that they hold all the moral compass. We think it's fundamentally bad. And especially when Russia are the only individuals that have decided that they're actually willing to put troops on the ground in Syria in order to fight ISIS. We don't get that from the West. What do? They want to take a stance of not doing anything but telling individuals that want to act that they shouldn't act. We think it's fundamentally bad when things like ISIS exist that are killing individuals and that are spreading their own like ideals of Islamic State in the Middle East. That's the problem, because it's not isolated. At least with Bashar al-Assad, you can keep him to Syria, but you can't keep ISIS to Syria. Why? Because the decision of ISIS is to spread its ideology like, in terms of like Iran. Sit down, right? We think that's the second point that I want to bring to you. They only tell you about Russia. I want to tell you about Iran and why Iran is justified in taking the actions that they take. You know why Iran is justified? Because Iran is in direct threat of ISIS spreading into Iran, right? So in any measure that Iran should take in order to protect itself, the same way that Israel does when it acts in terms of like Palestine, is justified to do that. Why is it justified to do that? We think because when harms are going to accrue to you, when individuals in terms of terrorist organizations believe that it's justified for them to go into your space and determine what you speak about, it's fundamentally good for you to protect yourself. It's fundamentally good for you to take actions in order to fight someone. They're not scared of Bashar al-Assad. Sit down, buddy. I'm not taking POI. I'm going. It's problematic for those reasons. Why? We think because Bashar al-Assad can always be put inside Syria, confined into Syria, but you can't do that with ISIS that has an agenda to take over the Middle East. Problematic. Iran has justified reasons for why to do this. But secondly, in terms of Iran, it's quite problematic that you want to censor Iran when you've just made a nuclear deal with them in order of how to work, right? I think it's fundamentally problematic when you look about geopolitical stances that should exist. You can't tell individuals that it's validated that they can make their own decisions in terms of having sort of like a nuclear structure, but also tell them that it's unjustified for them to take measures in order to defend themselves. We think that's the problem. Devon tells you that you started World War III in terms of Russia. I tell you secondly that it's problematic with Iran because you bring about tensions that we were fighting in order to eradicate. Problematic, that stance. But secondly, what do we tell you? The war on terror and the sort of analysis that the West gives you in terms of the war on terror. They love saying the war on terror and we need to fight terror, and they make terror like this biggest problem in the world. But it's also fundamentally bad for you to say we'd rather not have Bashar al-Assad, but they don't tell us what the vacuum exists, but also say no, we want to fight terror, but fundamentally that is not bigger than Bashar al-Assad. You need to choose a stance as the West. Is war on terror really that important? If it is, you will support individuals that want to fight the war on terror, that want to kill the war on terror, that want to kill terrorists and make sure that we eradicate terrorists in every part of the spheres that we have, even in a Bashar al-Assad-led regime. Problematic that you don't do that. We think that the greatest threat analysis is not brought to you by side-opening government. We think the greatest threat is ISIS. When we look at all the individual actions that ISIS does in terms of the Middle East, we think Bashar al-Assad is much better, even if we don't propose for him, but we think that's much better to fight and Russia to go into in terms of their military action in order to stop this. We're not being told by these individuals why the greatest threat analysis is not brought to you, why they don't say why Bashar al-Assad is more problematic than like ISIS. We think that's problematic. But also the last point that I bring you is this vacuum, right? The idea of vacuum and why the vacuum exists. When the vacuum exists, individuals start to take up the space that should be taken by other individuals that have legitimate claims to it. We think ISIS propels itself and all terror groups propel themselves in the idea that somehow no legitimate structure exists that can do the functions of the state. That's the problem that ISIS comes in and does this. And for the four reasons that I've given to you, and the four reasons that
I know. In 2008, when the Assad regime was actively responsible for the death of at least 300 of its own civilians, that it termed rebel, we think that the regime lost its recognition from its people. We think that this debate isn't about ending the war in Syria. It's about whether or not the West has an active obligation in stopping Russia and Iran. But more than that, so what opening government then tells us is they tell us why Russia and the Iranian action is bad in terms of its actual mechanism of the construct of war. We not only tell you what this means in terms of empowering the Assad regime, but more importantly, we speak about the implicit and explicit obligation that the West inherits to stop them from intervening. But before then, let's clarify three things. One, we tell you that we have to prove the principal obligation to act irrespective of whether or not we end the war. Secondly, we think, and this is important, the obvious problem is that Russia and Iran encourage more internal war. More importantly, Russia is making the Assad regime powerful. If by your analysis you're against Assad, what you're doing is you're encouraging a regime or you're encouraging a mechanism that strengthens the very same people that you're trying to protect. But thirdly, we tell you that the Assad regime, Assad himself, is an unpopular government which stays in power and will cling onto it. And this will become even more like part of my substantive. Two areas of explicit rebuttal. One, we tell you that the sanctions and diplomacy are a form of action, and that's what the debate asks. It asks for us to prove and argue on the level of action. Don't let opposition get away with forcing us to defend military intervention or action by a collective lot. That's not what we're arguing about. Second, no, let's then engage on the comparison. The supposed, let's have either Russia or like a unilateral government or unilateral support into it. We tell you that even in that world, we're better off. Why? Two things. One, we tell you that the Russian interests are biased. The fact that they choose a side means they actively, recognize one side to the next. No. Secondly, we tell you that the Western interests aren't. Why? We tell you that that's why things like vetoes happen. That's why it took very long for them to intervene. But even if that was the case, we would say that the collective self-interests of like an international group of individuals is far better and less harmful than the self-interests of two countries. We tell you that we're better off there. And we tell you that even in that instance, the comparison would be the action of sanctions. Thirdly, we tell you that they say that that Iran should go and it should do it as a mechanism to protect itself against ISIS. But here, and this is where they miss the link, we tell you that the attack that they have isn't on ISIS exclusively. They attack, what they're doing, what they're supporting, it's an attack on anyone and all entities that are against the Assad regime, which they characterize as bad. You don't tell us like a causal link as to why that level of just war going into war is good. I'm going to be speaking about a few things. Let's just calm the debate. I want to first speak about the notion of legitimacy. And here we give you critical analysis on why we don't recognize the government of Assad, but more than that, like why the actual mechanism in which we are using to prevent Russia from supporting it is okay. Two things when a government loses its legitimacy to represent its people. Firstly, we tell you that it's when the people themselves no longer recognize it. When the people no longer feel as though that is their government, and when they no longer recognize it as an entity that's important.
But secondly, we tell you that we no longer recognize a government as being for the people when it actively harms the people. So if you're going to be characterizing them as bad, we tell you that you can't then say, would rather have them as opposed to ISIS. We tell you that's principally inconsistent. You don't get away with that, not yet, Jess. The second thing that I want to speak about is the role of the West. And here's where the debate actually is. The debate is about whether or not the West has a role, like an explicit or an implicit obligation to stop Russia and Iran from intervening. Sit down, man. One, we tell you that there's like an implicit obligation. Here we tell you that inaction is just as bad as action. And we tell you that by them not doing anything, they are actually saying it's okay to happen there. And that's implicitly wrong. But secondly, we tell you that there's an explicit obligation from the West to act. What do I mean by this? I'm referring to two levels of obligation. The first is the current obligation. We tell you that any international body, specifically one that collectivizes, such as the IR, they have an explicit obligation to preserve the notions of peace. It's an explicit ticket issue to them. But secondly, we tell you that they have a future obligation. They have a future obligation on preventing regimes such as Assad, not one of encouraging them to continue as long as the alternative isn't bad, which is principally inconsistent. Sit down, gents. But more than that, we tell you that there's positive and negative obligation. We tell you here, and here's where we're nuanced, we say obligation, positive obligation, is when you do no harm to others. But we tell you that like negative obligation is when you prevent harm from being done to other individuals. So we tell you that even in this instance, they have the explicit and implicit obligation to act. The last thing that I want to speak about is the notion of disproportionality of the regime and how we actively empower something that's wrong. But before that, sir.
Okay, so the war has ground to a stalemate. 200,000 people are dead, 8 million are displaced. How many more people die defending your weak principles?
So if the debate was about what would we do to ensure that after the war we have individuals better looked after, we'd run the analysis there. But the debate is whether or not we should actively intervene right now, stop the interests of a selfish individual, such as Russia, that you do, irrespective of what may or may not happen in the long run. And here, the conclusion to the disproportionality of the regime point is the fact that we empower a regime that's being fought by its own people. So here in a POI, they say, well, the West is bad. The US, for instance, is supporting ISIS. Firstly, we tell you that that's not necessarily the West as itself, it's the US. But secondly, we tell you that if it does happen, okay, so if it does happen, if America is doing and is actively supporting ISIS, we tell you that what it's doing is it's balancing the scale. At the point at which you're not able to recognize which party or which specific entity should run and govern a country, when you actively harm that discourse, you actively harm that power dynamic when you fund one side disproportionately. So even in the instance in which that's bad, we tell you that what then America does is it balances things out. Because we're the side that's grounded to reality, because we're the side that tells you where the debate is and what's best for the people in Syria, we're the side that wins the Free State Open. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, part of the reason why the war in Iraq has lasted for so long is because the Iraqis the Iranian state has been divorced of its power to protect its people. And this divorce specifically came from the West. As soon as the West undermined the Syrian state and funded rebels within that country, it created the instability that we see to this very day, having 200,000 people dead today. And having Iran intervene, having Russia intervene, is an intervention that necessarily strengthens the Assad state to protect its own people within its own country. And this is particularly what we support. I got 4 points of argumentation. My first point of argumentation, I'll be talking about the creation of a necessary counterbalance in the international community, a counterbalance of power. Secondly, I'll be talking about the importance of a regional hegemony. Thirdly, I'll be talking about how this creates an enabling environment for proxy wars within the Arab region. And lastly, I'll be talking about the loss of faith of existing security structures right now, right? But before I do that, let me deal with some rebuttal that came from closing government, right? So firstly, he tells us that, look, Russia and Iran are the kind of countries that encourage civil war in the Arab region, right? We tell you quite the opposite, right? Iran actually does not have any interest of having a civil war happening within the very region that it finds itself in geographically in the first instance. In fact, the people that have been most likely encouraging civil war on the ground have been America, right? By funding and by financing rebel groups within Arab regions, right? This is precisely why the civil war in the Arab region has been strengthened all along, right? Secondly, he tells us that Russia's interests are biased, right? Because they intervened too late, because of the lobbies, etc., right? But we tell you that the Iranian interests are actually the most important interest within this particular region, right? Because Iran has a particular interest or particular bias towards stability within the Middle East, right? You don't want rebel groups like ISIS coming into your own country. That is why you particularly want to make an intervention. And even if you get Russia to help you, that's a necessary aid in achieving this end, right? And he gives us this analysis on like the role of the West, right? And how inaction from the West is tantamount to action and tantamount to bad action in the West, right? We tell you that the obligation to peace, the obligation to security cannot only be given to the West. The obligation of peace and security can also be given to Iran because it's in the region, right? The role of peace and security can be given to Russia as well, right? So they cannot take a monopoly on that ideological stance in the first instance, right? But we tell you that US action in Iraq, US action in Afghanistan, US action in Pakistan has actually caused all the instability you're talking about, right? So US action has actually been terrible for the region that you're actually wanting to protect in this regard. You're already out of the debate, okay? Now, let me start with a little bit of a contextualization before I begin with my positive matter, right? So, let's context this. The Arab Spring, right? So we tell you the story of a young man from Tunisia who burnt himself in the middle of everybody, right? In order as an act of protest against the regime that he was fighting in that particular country, right? What made that action legitimate was the fact that it was the popular sentiment on the ground to have the region or to have the regime itself in Tunisia fall. That same happened for Hosni Mubarak, right? Because the popular sentiments were on the ground in Egypt, and that is why that rebellion and that movement became so important in Egypt, right? But what delegitimized the spring in Syria was the fact that it was a minority opinion from a military group trying to take away Assad's regime, right? It is not actually popular sentiment on the ground that Assad must move, right? This is actually false analysis that we get from side closing government and opening government as well, right? We tell you that it has already in the first instance been an illegitimate coup, illegitimate intervention from the people as a result, right? And this clashes nicely with the legitimacy point that they bring all together, right? And this is why it's bad, and this is why it's an illegitimate. It was an illegitimate uprising that came within Iran, right? And that's why it's more than legitimate, right, to actually to fund the state of Iran in order to protect its own people, right? Secondly, we give you this issue of haphazard foreign policy that we see in America, right? We've seen in many instances that the US foreign policy or the West foreign policy has been very haphazard in this regard, right? By funding rebel groups and destabilizing the regions, destabilizing the actual nations or the sovereigns within the Middle Eastern region actually caused more warfare within that particular country, right? So in 2011, IS was actually funded by the American government, right? In the 1970s, the Taliban was funded by the American government, which subsequently created Al-Qaeda, right? Their intervention has necessitated serious war and destruction within this particular region, right? And it leads me nicely to my first argument, which is the creation of a necessary counterbalance within the international community, right? So firstly, the West is no longer seen as the actor that will intervene when there's war, when there's instability, right? Now, there's a plurality of actors that are seen to be making that necessary action towards peace and security in this region, right? So this means, right, that rebels can no longer target the West as an enemy. And why is this important, right? It thins their ideology completely because it's hard to recruit any more people if you're going to tell people that the West is no longer the only enemy, now Iran is, right? It's very hard for ISIS to actually recruit people in that regard, and this is why it's an important argument to make, right? But secondly, the importance of regional hegemony, right? So a regional hegemon is important because what it does is that it's legitimate within its own region to ensure peace and security within its own particular region, right? Why? This is because of the geographical location of that hegemony, and secondly, because of the ethnic relation that it has to its surrounding people as well, right? So Iran, like we said, does have the legitimate control and should have a monopoly over this intervention within the region itself, right? Because it is the legitimate actor to ensure peace and stability within the Iranian region, right? So we tell you, for the sake of optimizing peace and stability and finally ending the war in Syria, we are proud to oppose.
Pure eyes, dog. Frank gets to T5.
It's funny how female debaters are accused of being too emotional, when the men in this room have failed to analyze what is going on and have failed to bring an actual strategic analysis. So let me allow and play that role for you. Once again, as an inexperienced debater, will educate experienced debaters in how you're actually supposed to debate. So let's move through the logic of today's debate. So what the motion says, what the motion states, is that this House, as the West, would prevent Russia and Iran from acting in Syria. This debate never called on the government side to prove that we're going to end the war in Syria. It called that we have to prove that the West should prevent Russia and Iran from acting within Syria. That was the point of the government bench in today's debate. They missed our burden. They misplaced our burden. So what is this then? If we say this, it means when Devon comes up and tells us, it's okay, we can just ask our son to leave because he's such a cool guy sitting on a couch, he's going to leave whenever we tell him, he needed to prove that the Assad government was a government we wanted to be in place in Syria in the first place. And that was our extension when we spoke to you about the illegitimacy of the Assad regime and how we don't want the Assad regime to be in there in the first place. Devon never told us how the Assad regime was a good enough government to go there. So we gave you two criteria of when a government is legitimate. We firstly spoke to you about when they actually meet the interests of their people. When there's a rebel group within your country that stands up because you aren't meeting the needs, you aren't legitimate. The Assad government stayed in power for years. The people wanted him to go, like every other rebel spring that came up. They wanted him to leave. That's why his legitimacy left when he started to attack his own people, when he started to actually harm his own people. We don't want our side in power, and therefore Russia supporting our side isn't good enough. The next thing in terms of clarification is what told us in the closing round. They said, we want Iran and Russia to act. We have to contextualize what is this action you're taking? Because the info slide said the action you're taking is using airstrikes, right? Airstrikes that are harming innocent people. Yes, you can protect your own country, but not at the cost of other innocent civilians of another country. You guys never showed us why the action you're taking in this case is good enough to win today's debate. You've already lost, boys. Sit down. So moving on into this case, I'll be looking at three questions. One, what is the obligation of the West? Two, comparing Russia and West intervention. And lastly, looking at what is going to happen in this debate. So we brought you a beautiful analysis that hasn't been touched yet by the other side. We told you how in law, the action of not acting is just as good as acting. When you don't stop Russia and Iran from using airstrikes to kill innocent people, you are just as good as who they are. You are in the same power as the Assad regime because you are allowing them to kill innocent people. You are allowing them to have this hegemony within Russia, to have this hegemony within Iran. We told you how therefore this West has an implicit obligation to act. They never responded to our analysis, they never responded to our characterization. Secondly, we told you how they have a future obligation to act to prevent further regimes from standing up and harming people. Once again, no response. So our point obligation of the West still stands as it hasn't been responded to. Now let's move on to what they actually did say. And here we compare Russia and Iran intervention. And what they say is, Russia is so cool. So let's look through the analysis. They say, every country has a perverse incentive. Therefore, we want Russia and Iran, with their perverse incentive, to be the ones acting within Syria. You had to prove to us why the perverse incentive was okay for them to act. What we say is the West is going to play a mediatory role, as the UN plays when they go into a country. They aren't going to support the rebels or support the government. They're going to prevent the disproportionality Sakhile spoke to you about, when the government has so much power and the rebels have no power at all, when the government's allowed to disenfranchise its own people because they don't have support. Secondly, they told you that Russia is willing to negotiate. That analysis proves that the West is doing something to prevent Russian action because they negotiated with Russia to stop them from acting. You guys conceded our point of sanction. You see our point of why negotiations would work within your matter. The second thing I spoke to us about is how Iran needs to act to prevent ISIS. Will this stop ISIS? ISIS has grown ever since the West or Russia started to fund the al-Shabaab regime. And why did ISIS grow? Because people around the world realized that there are innocent people in Syria who are dying because Russia is supporting al-Shabaab. Therefore, ISIS will continue to get power as long as Russia continues to support al-Shabaab. People will see ISIS as the victim. They're able to play the victim role in today's society, to say, look what Russia and Iran are doing to us. They are killing us. People see them as the victim. People go and join ISIS because they want to end the disproportionality. You don't end ISIS under your case. You don't end the war. So why is the West good enough? The only actor that spoke about in today's debate was America. America went against UN policy when they invaded in Iran. America went against UN policy when they invaded in Afghanistan. This debate did not talk about America invading. This debate talked about the Western world invading. Therefore, your analysis couldn't just be limited to why America is bad. You have to prove to us why the whole Western world as a whole is bad for intervention. And we say why they're not bad. It's because what the West is going to do in this case is to even out disproportionate power that is within Russia itself, where these rebel groups have so little power and these government groups have way too much power. But then the West is going to play a mediatory role. But once again, our burden was to show you why the West needs to stop Russia from acting within the situation. We don't think we need to have two parties supporting either side. The West needs to support Russia from actively supporting one side. Last question, what is likely to happen? Here we had a weird point about World War III. No, people won't just start shooting each other. It's called mutual destruction theory. I'm not going to throw nuclear bombs on you because I'm scared you're going to throw nuclear bombs on me. It will not be World War III because that's mutual destruction theory. Secondly, they said that we're going to be breaking ties with Iran. We say sometimes those ties are worth it if Iran's actions are harming innocent people. You're willing to take on those actions. You're willing to make the sacrifices in the protection of the innocent. You're okay with doing that. So once again, what was today's debate at the core? It was about two countries taking a side in Syria. How that action of military strikes is harming innocent people. And how the West has an obligation to support this harm from happening. But furthermore, why the West has an obligation to support an illegitimate government from coming into power. They never showed you why Al-Shabaab was good enough. They never showed you why the West doesn't have any power in this case. They've lost today's debate. And I'm once again happy to propose. Thank you.
Madam Chair, as soon as Bettina came up and said her speech today, the only memory I could evoke is that of a 4-minute video I saw on Facebook yesterday with the guy asking his best friend why he lies so much. That is exactly what I got from Bettina's speech. Because when I heard about the info slide specifically mentioned how Russia and Iran are going to target ISIS, right, in order to defend the Assad regime. So for us to not argue how we're going to suppress terrorism in Syria is completely disingenuous to what the motion is asking us to do. But over and above that, I will engage with some of the faux matter that they brought us about how we should speak about the actors involved in this by delegitimizing why the West is the right actor in this instance, right? And I'll integrate most of my rebuttal in my speech, right? So most importantly, we have to look at the framing that Tammy brought us, right? Is the nature of the Arab Spring, which is where Syria's problem started, right? In many of the countries that had an Arab Spring, the reason for it was a popular uprising, such as Egypt, which is why theirs ended in a matter of like 6 months, because the majority of the country wanted a regime change. Tunisia's one was swift. Libya's one was even swift. The reason why Syria's one takes so long is because the masses aren't mobilized enough to go against the state, which means the masses did in fact trust the state of Syria and the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Despite the fact that he's a dictator, we recognize the fact that the manner in which we want to take away his leadership is not legitimate in today's debate. But over and above that, we have to look at the fact that the Syrian state under the al-Assad regime is the most capable regime of dealing with these terrorist groups and not necessarily having a unilateral Western action to deal with the domestic issue, especially when the West doesn't really have a buy-in into dealing with the issues in Syria. So most importantly, the framing that we gave you here also comes from the historical and the principal practices of the West and why those have been illegitimate. But I'll engage with those later on in my speech, not take it, right? So Essentially, this debate boils down to three issues. The first one being the interests of the actors involved. Secondly, is the nature of Western actions versus those of Russia and Iran. And lastly, is which model of intervention is the best model of intervention. And I'll integrate most of my rebuttal in these speeches. So firstly, the interests of the actors involved. And as has been alluded to by OO and analyzed by Tammy, right? This whole idea about Iran being the best actor to deal with the issues in Syria. The reason for that is that they're a regional actor within the Arab League, which is the body that oversees the security concerns within the Arab world, but over and above that, their own domestic security, right? They have a better buy-in, as opposed to America, who don't even send their soldiers to Syria, right? They'd rather send a drone to kill a bunch of civilians because they don't have a buy-in to deal with this matter in the right way. Whereas Iran does have an interest in dealing with the tensions in Syria in the correct manner, right? We also get this idea about how Russia is only doing this to antagonize the West, right? We say that's fine because it breaks up the hegemon that the US has over the Middle East, and it creates some sort of accountable global structure, not just an accountable West structure, but an accountable global structure to deal with the problems in Russia, in Syria, right? And even then, so what if Russia installs like 2 or 3 military bases? Because when America intervenes there, right, they install like 2 or 3 military bases and a McDonald's and a Burger King. So not only do you die from a war, but you might just die from cholesterol as well. And what America essentially does is sustain its control and sustain the tensions that are present in those countries through legitimate actions like funding freedom fighters, like the rebel groups, such as ISIS, which in 2011 wasn't recognized as a terrorist organization, but instead as an organization that is in need of Western funding to fight the Assad regime, right? So this illegitimate actor, being the West, largely led by the US, is not the sort of actor we want dealing with the problems in Syria. Secondly, this whole idea about the nature of the West's actions, right? So what we get from this side of the house is that the US, the West is this multilateral body that consults each other and then makes decisions as a group and makes the best decisions in the interest of global peace, right? Firstly, we disagree with this because most of the West decisions have been the prescription of the United States, right? Because in 2003, when France, Germany, Italy, and every country in the European Union refused to go into Iraq, that didn't stop America from going into Iraq because America is not kept accountable by the West. So this whole idea from this side of the house that the West is the most accountable structure is completely flawed because the West's actions have always been tantamount to the US's actions and the US's prescription. Which is why as soon as they invade a country, they start installing things like US capitalism, Burger King, things like that. American liberal democracy, right? And we particularly have a problem with the nature of the West actions. Not taken. Whereas with the Russian-Iran situation, what we'll find, and what Tammy mentioned, right, is you have 2 distinct actors. One is Russia, which is an external actor, right, that can facilitate with the military intervention as well as dealing with terrorist groups. The second one is Iran, which is a much closer and regional actor that not only wants to help its neighbor, but also wants to prevent itself from getting an airstrike or some terrorist attack due to a spillover of terrorism from from Syria, right? So these are the sort of actors that we want at the end of the day. Because unlike America, which bullies its Western counterparts despite NATO's democratic structure, in this instance you have a proper pluralistic structure within that alliance, right? Because you've got 2 superpowers. Over and above that, we feel it is legit because, stay standing Washington, over and above that, we feel it is legitimate because Iran has shown that it's willing to cooperate in the global community when we look at things like the recent Iran nuclear deal. This is a country that wants peace and wants to cooperate with its people. They've done a better job at diplomacy than America has in the last 20 years. Watch.
You don't talk about the legitimacy of Iran's intentions when they're being controlled by Russia. And the accountability we give to the West is still better than
this whole idea about how Iran is being controlled by Russia is completely flawed, right? Because at the end of the day, Iran has built like pluralistic diplomatic relations with the West, as we can see with the nuclear deal, as well as with Russia. They are not puppets of the Russian state. They are by far the most accountable actor, if there is any, right? So lastly, this whole idea about the model of intervention. And what we get from this side of the house is this airy-fairy principle about how we should instead instill sanctions. What do sanctions do? they weaken the Assad regime, right? But ISIS is not a part of the mainstream economy, right? So if you weaken the Assad regime and their ability to deal with terrorism, all you do is strengthen the terrorist groups that caused the problems in the first place, right? So what they've told us is completely legitimate. But what we've told you from closing opposition is that the sort of intervention we want is the sort of intervention that involves military strikes of these terrorist groups in order to keep the legitimate state of al-Assad's regime running Syria, right? Over and above that, it creates a plethora of enemies for these terrorist organizations to attack, and that thins their ideology and thins the enemy at the end of the day. The Hail Mary pass is going to sink this touchdown, as well as the entire government case, is that they failed to recognize that the West doesn't have the instincts